The lock had been cut clean through. I found it lying in the grass beside the gate. Severed metal gleaming in the morning sun. Tire tracks led down to my private lake. Beer cans littered the shoreline, and on the gate post, a flyer. Lakewood Lake Day, thank you for joining us. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from, because this story is about to get intense. They had not just trespassed. They had celebrated on my land and signed their work. Standing there, I did not feel anger. I felt something colder. They thought they had won. They had no idea what they had just started. I stood at the gate for a long moment, staring at the evidence of what they had done. The cut lock told only part of the story. The rest was written in tire tracks that carved through my pasture, in beer cans scattered along the shoreline like confetti after a party, in the cheap pool float still hanging from a tree branch as if someone might come back for it. But the detail that mattered most was the flyer taped to the gatepost, Lakewood Lake Day, thank you for joining us. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from, because this story is about to get intense. They had not just trespassed on my property. They had treated it as their own, celebrated on it, and left behind a signed confession of exactly who was responsible. The Lakewood Estates logo sat in the corner of that flyer like a fingerprint at a crime scene. Something shifted inside me as I peeled the flyer from the post and folded it carefully into my pocket. Not anger. Anger is hot and fast and fades. This was different, colder, more patient, the kind of feeling that settles into your bones and waits. I had spent 20 years as a corporate attorney, navigating conflicts where the loudest voice rarely won, and the most prepared party almost always did. I knew how to build a case. I knew how to wait for the right moment. And I knew that the people who had done this, whatever, had authorized this Lake Day on my private property, had just made the first move in a game they did not understand. My name is Jose Cole. 5 years ago, I walked away from a corner office and a partnership track that was killing me slowly. I bought this ranch with the settlement from my last case, 120 acres of Texas hill country, including a spring-fed lake that had belonged to the same family for 3 generations before I acquired it. The deed is unambiguous. The survey is recorded. Every inch of that water sits on my land, and no easement or access agreement has ever been granted to anyone. I moved here with my wife Margaret to find something we had lost in the city silence. Space. The ability to breathe without checking a calendar first. For 2 years, we had exactly that. Then Lakewood Estates appeared on the horizon, and the silence began to crack. The development went up half a mile down the road. 300 homes marketed with promises of lakeside living and waterfront amenities. What the glossy brochures failed to mention was that no lake belonged to the HOA. The developer had sold an illusion, and someone had decided that my property would make that illusion real. The first intrusion came 18 months ago, teenagers swimming off my dock, genuinely confused when I told them they were trespassing. The HOA lady said we could use the lake, one of them explained. I corrected the misunderstanding and assumed it would end there. I was naive. The teenagers were not an accident. They were a test. I knew who had sent them. Brenda Holloway, 54 years old, president of the Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association. She had knocked on my door 3 times in the past year. Each visit, a new strategy. First came cookies and charm, a neighborly suggestion that I share the lake for the children. And then came a formal letter from the HOA board, offering to negotiate reasonable terms. The third visit dropped the pretense entirely vague warnings about what happens when communities feel excluded from resources they deserve. Each time, I declined. Each time she left with the same expression, a smile that stopped at her lips and eyes that promised this was not over. The cut lock was her answer to my refusals. I called the sheriff's department and waited 45 minutes for Deputy Martinez to arrive. He documented everything: photographs of the lock, measurements of the tire tracks, notes on the flyer, and delivered a conclusion I had expected, but still found frustrating. Without camera footage or witnesses identifying individuals, this is a civil matter. Property dispute between you and the HOA. I recommend documentation and legal counsel. He was technically correct, which made it worse. The system designed to protect property rights had just told me I was on my own. I thanked him, watched his cruiser disappear down the road, and began planning what came next. That evening, I ordered a security system, 4 weatherproof cameras with night vision, motion activation, and cloud backup, $2,400 to protect what was already legally mine. As I completed the purchase, Margaret appeared in the doorway of my office. "What are we going to do?" she asked. I looked at the folded flyer on my desk, the Lakewood Estates logo visible through the creased paper. "We are going to find out exactly who did this," I said. "And we are going to make sure they understand that this land is not theirs to take." 3 days until the cameras arrive. The preparation had begun, and somewhere in Lakewood Estates, Brenda Holloway was probably celebrating what she thought was a victory. She had no idea she had just handed me the first piece of evidence in the case I was about to build against her. The cameras captured their first trespass 2 weeks after installation. Saturday afternoon, 4 figures approached from the east, 2 adults, 2 children, carrying coolers and folding chairs. They climbed over the fence where old posts had loosened, walked directly to the shoreline, and spent 3 hours swimming and picnicking on my land. I watched the footage that evening, pausing on the clearest frame of the man leading the group. Navy polo shirt with a familiar logo, the Lakewood Estates HOA emblem. His face matched a photograph from the HOA website. Derek Simmons, 46 years old, board member, Brenda Holloway's closest ally. The woman who had complained about my selfishness had sent her lieutenant to establish a beachhead on my property. This was not a coincidence. This was a deployment. I drove to Derek's house the next morning with 3 printed photographs. His wife answered, called him down, and her expression shifted from polite curiosity to discomfort when she saw the images. Derek appeared in gym shorts and a wrinkled t-shirt, his face cycling through surprise, confusion, and guilt before settling on defensive blankness. "Mr. Simmons, this is you on my property yesterday. My land, my lake, private property. This cannot happen again." He studied the photographs, then shrugged. "Someone told me the lake was community property. I did not realize there was a problem." I asked who told him. His eyes flickered away. "I do not remember exactly. Maybe something at an HOA meeting." He returned the photos and closed the door. The deflection confirmed what I already suspected: he was following orders. And naming the source would mean naming his president. I spent the rest of the day reviewing HOA documents I found online, meeting minutes, community newsletters, event calendars. The pattern was unmistakable once I knew what to look for. 3 Lake Day events had been announced in the past 8 months, each one scheduled without my knowledge or consent, each one treating my property as a community amenity. The newsletters referred to our beautiful lake and Lakewood's natural treasure language designed to create the impression of shared ownership. Brenda was not just encouraging trespass, she was manufacturing a narrative. One newsletter at a time, one event at a time. Building a story that her community had always used this lake and always would. That evening, headlights swept across my front windows. A knock followed sharp. Impatient, I opened the door to find Brenda Holloway on my porch, arms crossed, chin lifted in righteous indignation. She did not wait for pleasantries. "Mr. Cole, I understand you have been harassing members of our community with photographs and accusations. Lakewood Estates is a family neighborhood. We do not appreciate intimidation." Her voice dripped with sweetness, but her eyes were stone. I kept my tone level. Mrs. Holloway, your board member, was photographed trespassing on my private property. The lake belongs to me. The deed is recorded with the county. She smiled that familiar, tight expression. Communities have a way of asserting their rights when individuals refuse to be reasonable. This lake has been enjoyed by Lakewood residents for months. Perhaps you should consider whether fighting 300 families is worth your peace of mind. She turned and left before I could respond. I stood in the doorway, parsing her words. Months. Asserting their rights. This was not careless phrasing. This was legal positioning. I went to my computer and searched Texas property law until midnight. What I found confirmed my fears. Prescriptive easement, the doctrine that allows trespassers to claim permanent access rights if they can prove continuous, open use for a statutory period without effective opposition from the owner. 10 years in Texas. Brenda was running a clock. Every organized trespass, every lake day, every newsletter claiming community ownership was another data point in a future court filing. She was not trying to annoy me into surrender. She was building a case to take my property through the legal system itself. The realization landed like cold water. Every picnic I failed to document was evidence of my acquiescence. Every trespass I did not prosecute strengthened her claim that I had permitted community use. Ignoring the problem was not neutrality, it was surrender. Brenda had weaponized my desire for peace against me, counting on me to choose quiet over conflict. She had miscalculated. I had spent 20 years building cases in conference rooms and courtrooms. I knew how to fight wars of documentation. I knew how to wait. And now I knew exactly what she was trying to do. The next morning, I called Pamela Cook, a real estate attorney whose reputation for property disputes was well known in the county. Her assistant put me through within minutes. I have a situation, I said. Someone is trying to steal my lake one picnic at a time. They are manufacturing evidence of community use to support a future easement claim. I have footage, documents, and a timeline. What I need is a strategy to stop them before they get any further. There was a brief pause, then a dry laugh. Mr. Cole, you just described one of my favorite kinds of cases. Come to my office tomorrow. Bring everything you have. I hung up and looked at the stack of printed photographs on my desk, Derek climbing my fence. Families on my shoreline. Flyers advertising events on land that did not belong to them. The evidence was accumulating. The pattern was clear. Now it was time to build a counterattack. Pamela Cook's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house in the county seat. All dark wood and leather chairs and framed degrees that spoke of decades in the courtroom. She was 50 years old, silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, with the kind of focused attention that made you feel like every word you said was being filed for future reference. I spread my evidence across her conference table photographs, footage printouts, HOA newsletters, the flyer from my gatepost, and walked her through the timeline. She listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression revealing nothing. When I finished, she leaned back and studied me for a long moment. Mr. Cole, you have good instincts. You recognized what they were doing before most property owners would have. But you are also behind. Documentation is necessary, but documentation alone does not stop a clock. She outlined the strategic implications with clinical precision. Every trespass I failed to formally oppose could be cited as evidence that I had acquiesced to community use. Letters to local police were not enough. I needed certified written warnings to every individual trespasser. Return receipt requested, creating an undeniable paper trail that I was actively defending my property rights. Once they sign for these letters, they cannot claim ignorance, Pamela said. More importantly, If they trespass again after receiving a formal legal warning, it becomes criminal trespass with intent, a Class B misdemeanor in Texas, punishable by up to 180 days in jail and $2,000 in fines. She slid a folder across the table. Send these to every person your cameras have identified, and a separate letter to the HOA board. When they come back, and they will come back, you will have the legal foundation to pursue actual consequences. I asked about the HOA's organizational liability. Pamela's smile turned sharp. That is where Brenda Holloway made her mistake. An individual trespasser faces minor penalties, but an organization that systematically coordinates trespass opens itself to civil action for harassment, intentional interference with property rights, and conspiracy. If we can prove she is directing these incursions as HOA president, she becomes personally liable, not the association's insurance, her assets, her reputation, her future. She tapped her pen against the legal pad. The letters are step 1. Step 2 is waiting for them to ignore the warnings. Step 3 is making an example that the entire community will remember. I left her office with a strategy that finally matched the threat. But before I could execute it, Brenda accelerated her timeline. The following Saturday morning, I noticed unusual activity on the HOA's online calendar, an event listing that had appeared overnight, backdated to look like it had been planned for weeks. Lakewood Summer Celebration, it read. Community Lake Day, all families welcome. She had scheduled another invasion of my property and manufactured the appearance that it had been organized long in advance. The paper trail was deliberate. She was building evidence of established community events for her eventual court filing. My cameras captured the convoy arriving at 9:30 that morning. 12 vehicles in formation, led by Brenda's white SUV. They did not even attempt the fence this time. They drove straight to my gate. And through my telephoto lens, I watched Brenda herself step out with bolt cutters in hand. She did not delegate the task or hide her face. She posed for a moment, almost theatrical, ensuring that anyone watching would see the HOA president personally leading the charge. Then she cut my lock with 2 quick snaps and waved the convoy through like a traffic officer clearing an intersection. This was not the cautious maneuvering of someone building a legal case in shadows. This was a public declaration of ownership, performed for an audience of her own supporters. I drove down to confront them, phone recording as I walked. The scene at the shoreline had transformed into a festival tents, tables, a portable grill smoking with burgers, a banner strung between trees reading, Lakewood Summer Celebration. Children splashed in water that belonged to me. Adults lounged in chairs on land I had cleared with my own hands. And at the center stood Brenda, no longer just directing traffic, but holding court, accepting thanks and praise from families who believed she had given them something that was never hers to give. She saw me approaching and moved to intercept, her smile widening into something that looked almost like triumph. Mr. Cole, what a pleasant surprise. Would you like to join our community gathering? I kept my voice level. Mrs. Holloway, you cut my lock. You brought these people onto private property. I am asking everyone to leave immediately. She tilted her head with exaggerated confusion. Trespassing. This lake has been enjoyed by our community for nearly 2 years. We have documentation newsletters, photographs, and event calendars. This is shared space now. I called Deputy Martinez. He arrived 20 minutes later, assessed the crowd, and pulled me aside with genuine frustration in his voice. Mr. Cole, I understand your position, but I have 30 people here, including children, without an active injunction or prior filed charges. I cannot arrest anyone. I can only request that they leave. If I try to forcibly remove families with kids, someone gets hurt, and the liability falls on the department. He was right, and Brenda knew it. She had engineered a situation where enforcement would look like overreach. where the optics of police removing children from a community picnic would turn public sympathy against me. Martinez asked the crowd to disperse. They complied slowly, gathering their things with deliberate leisure, leaving behind crushed grass and scattered trash, and the unmistakable message that this was just the beginning. As the last car pulled away, Brenda paused beside her SUV. "Same time next month. Mr. Cole, unless you would like to negotiate reasonable terms for permanent access." She drove off without waiting for my response. I stood alone in the wreckage of their celebration, surrounded by debris they had not bothered to collect. The letters would go out Monday morning, 14 certified warnings to every individual my cameras had identified, plus formal notice to the HOA board. Pamela had promised that once they signed for those letters, the legal landscape would shift entirely. The next time Brenda cut my lock, she would not be leading a picnic. She would be committing a crime with documented intent, and I would be ready. The letters went out Monday morning, 14 certified warnings to individuals. My cameras had identified, plus a formal notice to the HOA board. Return receipts began arriving within the week. Brenda signed for hers on Wednesday. Derek signed on Thursday. By the following Monday, I had documented proof that every trespasser now understood the legal stakes. The foundation was laid. But Brenda had no intention of retreating quietly, instead of responding through lawyers. She opened a second front one where property deeds and legal statutes meant nothing. She took the fight to public opinion, 3 days after signing for her warning letter. Brenda posted a lengthy statement on the local community forum. The title read, "When One Man Holds Nature Hostage." She painted a portrait of a wealthy outsider threatening hard-working families with jail time for letting their children swim. No mention of property rights. No acknowledgement that the lake had never belonged to anyone but me. Just emotion, carefully crafted to maximize outrage. The post accumulated hundreds of reactions within hours. Comments piled up calling me a monster, a tyrant, a symptom of everything wrong with people who believed money entitled them to exclude others from nature. Brenda had transformed a legal dispute into a moral crusade, and she had cast herself as the righteous defender of community values. The online hostility was abstract until it reached Margaret. She called me from the grocery store 2 days later, her voice barely steady. A stranger had confronted her in the produce section, loud enough for other shoppers to hear, demanding to know what kind of person denies children access to a lake. Margaret had said nothing, paid for her groceries, and driven home fighting tears. When she walked through our door that evening, I saw something new in her eyes, not just hurt, but genuine fear. Fear of being recognized in her own community. Fear of what might happen next. I held her for a long time, promising this would end, knowing the ending was still far away. Brenda had turned our neighbors into weapons, and Margaret was paying the price for land she had every right to call home. The harassment shifted from words to action 3 nights later. I woke at 2 a.m. to the dogs barking frantically. Security footage showed 2 figures in dark clothing cutting my fence at 3 separate points, working quickly, methodically, and staying just outside the clear identification range of my cameras. They had studied my system. They knew where the blind spots were. By the time I reached the property boundary, they had vanished. One figure moved with a confident posture that reminded me of Derek Simmons, but the footage was too grainy for certainty. I filed a report with Deputy Martinez the next morning. He reviewed the video and explained the limitation I was already anticipating. Without clear facial identification or physical evidence linking specific individuals, I cannot make an arrest. Texas law requires probable cause, a reasonable belief that a specific person committed the crime. Dark clothing and a similar body type is not enough. He offered to increase patrol frequency near my property, but we both knew that would not stop people willing to cut fences at 2 in the morning. I reinforced the damaged sections and repositioned cameras to eliminate the blind spots. But the tactical response could not address what was happening inside our home. Margaret had stopped leaving the house unless necessary. I found myself checking the security feeds compulsively, waiting for the next incursion, unable to focus on anything else. Brenda had achieved something more effective than simple trespass. She had turned our refuge into a fortress under siege. The community saw her as a hero, fighting for families. They saw us as villains hoarding nature behind locked gates. The isolation was deliberate. The pressure was calculated, and the longer it continued, the more leverage she gained. That afternoon, I called Pamela and described the deterioration. She listened without interruption, then asked a question that reframed everything. "Jose, what do you actually know about Brenda Holloway's finances? Not her public persona, her actual stake in this fight." I admitted I had focused entirely on her actions, not her motivations. "People who behave this way rarely do so for ideology alone," Pamela said. "There is usually money involved. Find the financial motive, and you find the weakness." That night, I shifted my research from legal statutes to public records property filings, tax assessments, business registrations. I was no longer just defending my land. I was looking for the reason Brenda was so desperate to take it. The answer emerged from the county assessor's database shortly before midnight. Brenda Holloway owned not 1, but 3 lots in Lakewood Estates, 2 of them still vacant. Purchased 6 months before the development broke ground. She had bought early, betting on appreciation, and her investment depended entirely on the neighborhood's perceived value. I pulled comparable sales data and ran the numbers. Properties in developments with lake access sold for 15 to 20% more than those without. If Brenda could establish permanent access to my lake, her vacant lots would gain over $150,000 in value. Suddenly, every action made sense. The newsletters call it Our Lake. The backdated event calendars. The theatrical lock cutting was performed for an audience of potential buyers. She was not fighting for the community or the children. She was protecting an investment. And now I knew exactly what she stood to lose. Margaret found me at the computer past midnight, scrolling through property records. She set down a cup of coffee and studied the screen over my shoulder. 3 lots, she said quietly, understanding immediately. She bought in early, and she needs the lake to make her money back. I nodded. Every lake day she organizes is marketing. Every family she brings to swim is a potential witness for her easement claim. And every attack on us is designed to break our will before we expose what she is really doing. Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she looked at me with something I had not seen in weeks, not fear, but resolve. "Then we do not let her break us. We break her instead." I saved the records to a secure folder and began drafting an email to Pamela. The defensive phase was over. It was time to go on offense. Pamela called an emergency meeting the morning after I sent her the financial records. Her office felt different this time, less consultation, more war room. She had printed everything I discovered and spread it across the conference table alongside documents she had subpoenaed overnight through a records request to the HOA management company. Texas Property Code requires homeowners associations to maintain meeting minutes and make them available to property owners affected by their decisions. She explained, since their actions directly impact your land, they had to comply, and what they sent me fills in every gap. She slid a folder toward me. Inside were 18 months of complete HOA minutes, far more detailed than the summaries posted on their public website. The full minutes revealed operational precision I had only glimpsed in fragments. 17 months ago, Brenda had introduced a vague agenda item called Community Amenity Development that passed without discussion. 3 months later, internal correspondence showed her directing the newsletter editor to begin using the phrase Lakewood Lake instead of the lake near our community. 6 months after that, she proposed the first Lake Day event, describing it in board emails as establishing documented community use for future legal proceedings. The language was explicit. This was not enthusiasm that escalated into overreach. This was a legal strategy executed through HOA machinery, hidden behind cheerful event announcements and neighborly rhetoric. I mapped the timeline against what I already knew about her property purchases. The sequence tightened into something undeniable. She had bought her lots with insider access before general sales opened. She had positioned herself on the board within months of moving in. The Lake Access Initiative appeared in minutes exactly 2 weeks after her election as president. Every newsletter reference, every organized event, every confrontation with me served a single purpose: creating the paper trail necessary to claim prescriptive easement and multiply her investment. "This is fraud," I said. "She is using a community organization to pursue personal profit." Pamela nodded. "And as HOA president, she has fiduciary duty to act in residents' interests, not her own. Breach of that duty opens her to removal, civil liability, and potentially criminal charges. She built a weapon. We are going to turn it against her." The strategy took shape over the next hour. Phase 1: send a comprehensive letter to every Lakewood Estates household, explaining the lake's true ownership and Brenda's undisclosed financial stake. Phase 2: file formal complaints with both the county district attorney and the state real estate commission, presenting evidence of coordinated trespass and potential fraud. Phase 3: prepare civil litigation against Brenda personally for intentional interference with property rights, defamation, and conspiracy. "The goal is not just to stop her," Pamela said. "The goal is to make her an example that no one in that community will forget." I thought about Margaret's fear, the figures cutting my fence at night, 18 months of calculated assault on everything we had built. "Do it," I said. "All of it." The community letter went out by certified mail the following week, 300 copies to every Lakewood Estates household. The content was surgical factual, documented, impossible to dismiss as opinion. It included a copy of my deed with the lake boundaries highlighted. It reproduced key excerpts from HOA minutes showing Brenda's explicit references to future legal proceedings, and it disclosed her ownership of 3 lots purchased before general sales, with county assessor records proving the purchase dates. The letter concluded with a simple question: "Did your HOA president tell you about her personal financial interest in claiming access to private property?" I was asking residents to verify facts for themselves, to check public records, to read their own board minutes, to consider whether they had been manipulated. The response fractured along unexpected lines. Longtime residents who had trusted Brenda's leadership began questioning why she had never disclosed her property investments during board discussions about lake access. Newer families who had believed the community lake narrative started pulling records and discovering the same discrepancies I had documented. Online forums that had been echo chambers of hostility toward me now hosted genuine debate. Some voices still defended Brenda, dismissing the letter as retaliation, but others demanded answers. The certified mail format worked in my favor. Recipients could not claim they never received the information, and the formal legal presentation made casual dismissal more difficult. Brenda's unified coalition was splintering. She responded with an emergency community meeting scheduled for the following Saturday, promising to address false claims from outside interests. The framing was predictable. I was still the wealthy outsider. She was still the community defender. But the ground had shifted beneath her. Deputy Martinez called me the day before the meeting with an unexpected update. "The HOA filed a harassment complaint against you for the letter campaign. I reviewed the materials. Documented facts with source citations do not constitute harassment under Texas law. The complaint has no merit, and I told them so. He paused. They are throwing everything they can, hoping something sticks. That is not confidence, that is panic. I thanked him and hung up. Brenda had spent 18 months building a case against me. Now she was scrambling to defend herself. The momentum had reversed, and Saturday's meeting would determine whether her coalition held together or collapsed entirely. Saturday's emergency meeting was held in the Lakewood Estates Community Center, a beige building with fluorescent lights and folding chairs arranged in rows facing a raised platform. I arrived early, took a seat in the back corner, and watched the room fill. Nearly 200 residents showed up, far more than typical HOA meetings attracted. Some carried copies of my letter. Others clutched phones, scrolling through online discussions that had been raging all week. The atmosphere was charged with uncertainty, people who had believed one narrative for 18 months, now confronting documented evidence that contradicted it. Brenda stood near the front, greeting arrivals with practiced warmth, but I noticed tension in her shoulders and the way her smile faltered when residents failed to return it. Brenda took the microphone and launched into a prepared statement. She called my letter a coordinated attack designed to intimidate families exercising their rights. She referenced the harassment complaint, implying an ongoing investigation despite Deputy Martinez having already dismissed it. She produced photographs of Lake Day events showing happy families, newsletter excerpts, and testimonials from residents who described the lake as part of why we moved here. Her presentation was polished, emotional, and entirely focused on feeling rather than fact. Not once did she address the property deed. Not once did she explain the board minutes referencing future legal proceedings. Not once did she acknowledge her 3 lots or the financial benefit she stood to gain. A man in the third row raised his hand during the question period. "Mrs. Holloway, I pulled the county assessor records myself this week. You bought 3 lots 8 months before general sales opened. Did you disclose that ownership when you proposed the Lake Access Initiative?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Brenda's composure flickered. "My personal investments are not relevant to community business." A woman near the middle stood without waiting to be recognized. "I checked the records too. So did my husband. The purchase dates match exactly what the letter claimed." "Why did you never mention this during board votes?" Another voice from the back. "The meeting minutes are public. I read them. You wrote about building a legal case. Those are your words." The questions multiplied, overlapping, and residents who had independently verified the same facts now demanded the same answers. Brenda tried to regain control, calling for order, insisting the conversation had been hijacked by misinformation. But the people asking questions were not outsiders. They were her neighbors, her voters, homeowners who had trusted her leadership and now felt deceived. I left the meeting before it ended, having documented everything I needed. The community's faith in Brenda was cracking, but I knew she would not retreat. Backing down now meant admitting the entire Lake Access Initiative had been self-serving. It meant watching her reputation collapse and her property investments lose value. For someone who had built her identity around community leadership, surrender was not an option. She would push forward, hoping that one more show of force would restore the momentum she had lost. The next Lake Day was still scheduled for the following weekend. I called Deputy Martinez Monday morning to discuss enforcement options. His answer was direct and frustrating. "I cannot arrest someone for a crime they have not yet committed until they actually trespass on your property after receiving a written warning. No violation has occurred. Texas law does not allow preemptive detention based on announced intention." I understood the limitation, but pressed for what he could offer. "Position yourself where you can observe the entry point. If they cut your lock and enter after receiving certified warnings, that is criminal trespass with documented intent. I will respond immediately and make arrests on scene." He paused. Make sure your cameras capture faces clearly. Defense attorneys love reasonable doubt. I assured him the footage would be courtroom ready. I spent the week making final preparations. The 2 cameras covering the main gate were already upgraded to 4K resolution. With directional microphones, any conversation within 50 yards would be recorded with clarity. I tested every angle. Verified cloud backup was functioning, and confirmed that footage would upload in real time, even if someone destroyed the hardware. Pamela held the civil complaint ready for immediate filing the moment Brenda committed another documented trespass. Every legal instrument was positioned. Every contingency was covered. The only remaining piece was documentation that could not be dismissed as self-serving an independent witness with no stake in the outcome. I contacted Victoria Hayes, an investigative reporter for the county newspaper who had covered HOA disputes across the region. She reviewed my documentation for 2 days before calling back with interest. This is exactly the kind of story our readers care about: abuse of organizational power, manipulation of homeowners, personal profit disguised as community advocacy. If you are willing to grant me access, I want to be there when it happens. I consulted Pamela before agreeing. As a property owner, you have the absolute right to invite anyone onto your land, she confirmed. Granting press access to document events on your own property is not only legal, but it also strengthens your position. Brenda cannot claim media presence was unauthorized when you explicitly invited them. I called Victoria back and confirmed the details. She and a photographer would position themselves on my property Saturday morning, ready to document whatever unfolded. Margaret found me on the porch Friday evening, reviewing camera feeds on my laptop. She sat beside me without speaking, watching the screen as I cycled through each angle. "Is everything ready?" she finally asked. I closed the laptop and looked at her. The fear that had shadowed her eyes for weeks was still present, but it had been joined by something harder, the same resolve I had seen when she told me we would not let Brenda break us. "Everything is ready," I said. "Tomorrow she leads her people onto our property, thinking she is demonstrating community power. She has no idea that every step she takes will be recorded, witnessed, and used to end everything she has built." Margaret nodded once, her jaw set. Good. Make sure she understands exactly what she lost. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and the kind of stillness that precedes storms. I positioned myself on the porch of the cabin overlooking the lake, laptop open to display feeds from all 6 cameras. Deputy Martinez and his partner, Deputy Reyes, had parked their cruiser 200 yards from the main gate, concealed behind a cluster of oak trees where they could observe without being seen. Victoria Hayes and her photographer had arrived at 7:30, credentials verified and written permission signed, establishing them legally as my invited guests documenting events on private property. Margaret stayed inside the main house, phone ready. Every element was positioned. The only remaining question was whether Brenda would actually go through with it. The convoy appeared at 9:45, but it looked different from previous gatherings. 8 vehicles instead of 12. No festive banners on the cars. No music playing from open windows. The community fracture had taken its toll. Many residents who had attended earlier events had quietly declined this one after verifying the records for themselves. But Brenda's white SUV still led the procession, and behind her followed approximately 25 people, some looking eager, others visibly uncertain about what they had agreed to join. A woman in the 3rd car kept glancing at her phone, perhaps reading the online debates that had consumed the community all week. A man in the 5th car sat rigidly behind the wheel, his wife beside him with arms crossed and jaw tight. Brenda stepped out of her vehicle wearing a bright yellow sundress, as if costumed for a garden party rather than a property invasion. She walked to the gate with deliberate confidence, pausing to wave at the families behind her with the practiced gesture of a politician greeting supporters. Then she reached into her passenger seat and retrieved red bolt cutters, the same tool. Perhaps the same pair. That had severed my locks before. She positioned the blades around the padlock without hesitation. The metal parted with a sharp crack that my directional microphone captured from 50 yards away. She removed the broken lock, pushed the gate wide open, and turned back to the convoy with arms spread. "Welcome to our lake," she announced. "This is what standing together looks like." I understood why Martinez had insisted on waiting, until she actually cut that lock. No crime had been committed. Intent was not enough. The announcement was not enough. Only action created a legal consequence. The vehicles rolled through the open gate, but the energy was subdued compared to previous events. Some families cheered as they passed through, caught up in the moment. Others drove in silence, uncertainty visible in the way they gripped their steering wheels. One car hesitated at the threshold for nearly 10 seconds before finally proceeding. They parked near the shoreline and began the familiar ritual tents emerging from trunks. Coolers being unloaded, children released to run toward the water. But the atmosphere was muted. Conversations were quieter. Glances kept drifting back toward the gate, as if participants sensed that something was different about this particular lake day. Brenda moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations. But fewer people approached her than before. The doubts my letter had planted were visible in the distance people kept, the questions they did not ask, the enthusiasm they could not quite muster. I walked down from the cabin at 10:15, phone recording as I approached. Victoria Hayes and her photographer followed at a professional distance, capturing the scene from angles that would complement my own footage. Brenda saw me coming and moved to intercept, but her body language had shifted since the community meeting, less triumphant, more defensive. "Mr. Cole, I hope you have reconsidered your position. These families simply want to enjoy nature." I stopped 6 feet from her and spoke clearly for the microphones. "Mrs. Holloway, you cut the lock on my gate and led these people onto private property. Everyone here was warned in writing about the legal consequences. I am asking everyone to leave immediately." She lifted her chin. "We have documentation of community use going back nearly 2 years. No court will side with one man against 300 families." Behind her, some residents had stopped unpacking. A few were already gathering their children, reading the situation more accurately than their leader. The cruiser appeared through the gate with lights flashing, but no siren. Deputy Martinez and Deputy Reyes rolled to a stop 20 yards from the gathering, and the fragile festivity shattered completely. Parents grabbed children mid-stride. Conversations died. A teenage boy, who had been wading into the lake, turned and ran back to shore. Martinez approached Brenda with a folder in his hand, not the letters themselves, but documentation confirming receipt. "Mrs. Holloway, I have video evidence showing you cutting that lock approximately 30 minutes ago. You received a written legal warning that entering this property would constitute criminal trespass. You are under arrest for criminal trespass and criminal mischief." He produced handcuffs as he recited her rights. Brenda's composure cracked into something raw. "This is persecution," she shouted, voice rising. "He baited us here. He wanted this to happen." Martinez continued without raising his voice. "Ma'am, you announced this event publicly after receiving a legal warning. You brought tools to cut his lock. You made a choice. That choice has consequences." Deputy Reyes addressed the crowd, while his partner guided Brenda toward the cruiser. "Everyone here is currently on private property after receiving written notice. You have 5 minutes to collect your belongings and leave. Anyone remaining after that will be detained." The response was not uniform panic, but a wave of individual decisions, some families rushing immediately for their cars, others frozen in confusion, a few standing their ground for a moment before recognizing the futility. One man approached Reyes, asking if he was really going to be arrested for bringing his kids swimming. "Not today," the deputy replied. "But if you come back, yes." The man nodded once, gathered his family, and left without another word. Within 4 minutes. The shoreline was empty except for abandoned coolers and half-collapsed tents that no one had bothered to retrieve. Victoria Hayes approached me as the last vehicle disappeared through the gate. "I have the lock cutting, the arrest, and the crowd dispersing," she said. "My editor is already holding space for tomorrow's front page. Everything was documented from a position you legally authorized, so there is no question about the footage's admissibility or my right to be here." She glanced at the cruiser where Brenda sat motionless behind the glass. 18 months of building a case, and she destroyed it in 30 seconds with a pair of bolt cutters. I watched Martinez pull away, Brenda's face visible through the window, not angry anymore, not defiant, just emptied of everything she had believed about herself. The architect of the Lake Access Initiative was being driven to booking in handcuffs, her followers scattered, her credibility demolished in front of witnesses and cameras. The dust settled slowly on the empty road. Margaret appeared beside me, and for a long moment we simply stood together, watching the stillness return. The lake behind us reflected the late morning sky, undisturbed by strangers for the first time in months. She slipped her hand into mine. "Is it actually over?" I did not answer immediately. I let the silence hold, feeling the tension that had lived in my shoulders for 18 months begin to loosen. "The crisis is over," I finally said. "Prosecution will take time. The civil case will take longer. But Brenda Holloway will never set foot on this property again. And everyone who considered following her just learned what happens when you ignore legal warnings and commit crimes on camera." Margaret leaned into me, exhaling slowly. "I want to sit by the water," she said. "Just sit there, without watching for cars, or checking cameras, or wondering who is coming next." I put my arm around her. "Then that is exactly what we will do." The newspaper story ran Sunday morning with a photograph of Brenda being guided into the back of a patrol car, hands cuffed behind her, yellow sundress incongruous against the cruiser's black and white paint. Victoria Hayes had written a comprehensive account, the lock cutting, the arrest, the certified warnings ignored, the financial stake Brenda had concealed from her own community. By noon, regional outlets had picked up the story. By evening, it was circulating among property rights advocates and HOA reform groups who saw the case as a cautionary tale about unchecked neighborhood governance. The coverage framed exactly what I had hoped, not a wealthy landowner bullying families, but a community leader abusing her position for personal profit and facing consequences when someone refused to back down. The criminal case moved with unusual speed, driven by evidence that left no room for negotiation. My footage showed Brenda cutting the lock. Deputy Martinez had witnessed the act directly. The certified letters proved she had received an explicit legal warning and proceeded anyway. Her attorney attempted to argue established community use and selective enforcement, but the prosecutor dismissed both claims as irrelevant to the simple fact that she had committed criminal trespass on camera after written notice. 3 weeks after the arrest, facing a near-certain conviction at trial, Brenda accepted a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to criminal trespass and criminal mischief, Class B misdemeanors under Texas law. The sentence, 12 months probation, $5,000 in fines, 200 hours of community service, and a 5-year restraining order prohibiting her from entering my property or contacting me directly. Derek Simmons faced separate charges for his participation in the nighttime fence cutting months earlier. The original footage had been too grainy for identification, but Brenda's arrest changed his calculation. With her leadership collapsed and prosecutors examining every documented incident, Derek concluded that cooperation would serve him better than silence. He came forward voluntarily, admitted his involvement, and accepted a plea arrangement, 6 months probation and $2,000 in fines. 3 other residents who had been recorded trespassing after receiving warnings negotiated similar deals. The pattern of consequences rippled through Lakewood Estates, demonstrating that the warnings had been real and the legal system would enforce them. The civil case took longer, but produced more comprehensive results. Pamela filed suit against Brenda personally, Derek Simmons, and the HOA as an organization, alleging trespass, harassment, intentional interference with property rights, defamation, and conspiracy. The HOA's insurance carrier reviewed the evidence and immediately pressured the board to settle rather than face a jury trial they would almost certainly lose. Negotiations concluded 4 months after the arrest. The total compensation was $42,000, $25,000 from Brenda personally, $10,000 from the HOA's insurance policy, and $7,000 from Derek. The amount covered legal fees, security costs, property damage, and additional compensation for the harassment Margaret and I had endured. But money was not the most significant outcome. The settlement included a binding admission that the lake was private property with no public access rights ever. It required the HOA to publish a formal correction stating that all previous references to Community Lake had been unauthorized and inaccurate. Every such reference had to be removed from the website, newsletters, and archived documents. The false narrative Brenda had constructed was being systematically dismantled, replaced with documented truth that would prevent any future board from attempting the same strategy. The extended consequences reached further than I had anticipated. Victoria's story triggered an investigation by the State Real Estate Commission into whether Brenda's conduct constituted fraud in connection with property sales. Her license was suspended pending completion of the review. Her 3 investment lots, purchased expecting appreciation, instead lost value as the scandal attached to every listing. Comparable sales data showed Lakewood Estates homes selling for 8% below similar properties in neighboring developments. Buyers were actively avoiding the community because of the negative publicity. The scheme designed to increase her wealth had accomplished the opposite. The HOA transformed in the months that followed. An emergency election removed Brenda from the board by unanimous vote. The new president, a retired accountant who had been among the first to question her financial disclosures, implemented governance reforms requiring board members to disclose all property holdings and abstain from votes affecting their personal interests. The Lake Access Initiative was formally dissolved. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Lakewood Estates acknowledged where their community ended and my land began. I used part of the settlement to install permanent fencing 6 feet of powder-coated steel around the lake perimeter, with coded electronic gates and clear signage every 50 feet. The cameras remained operational, but in 8 months they had recorded nothing more threatening than deer and the occasional lost hiker who read the signs and turned back. Margaret and I sat on the dock one evening in late autumn, watching the sun descend toward the hills. The water reflected colors shifting from gold to orange to deep purple. No strangers on the shoreline, no tension waiting for the next incursion. She leaned against me, her hand finding mine. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just let them use it?" she asked. "If you had decided it was not worth fighting?" I considered the question. They would have taken it. Not immediately, but eventually. Brenda would have filed for a prescriptive easement and argued our silence meant acceptance. In 10 years, this dock might have belonged to the HOA. I watched the last light fade. Some boundaries cannot be compromised. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am glad you fought, even when I was scared." I pulled her close. "We fought, and now it is over." The stars emerged as darkness settled. Somewhere in Lakewood Estates, Brenda was serving her probation, her authority stripped, her investments diminished, her scheme exposed for exactly what it had been. She had believed persistence and community pressure could override legal boundaries. She had been wrong, and sitting on my dock, looking at water that belonged to my family for as long as we chose to keep it. I felt something I had not felt in 2 years, complete and untroubled peace.